Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. We carry out our work on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're delighted to share this conversation from our 2021 festival, featuring award-winning writer, scholar, poet, and critic Maggie Nelson. She's the author of the National Book Critics Circle Award-winning work, The Argonauts, a genre-bending memoir that gives a first-hand account of the complexities and joys of queer family-making, and Bluets, which was named by Bookforum as one of the 10 best books of the past 20 years. Maggie Nelson speaks here about her latest book with Vancouver-based bookseller-turned-librarian Baharak Yousefi. On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint is an essential book for challenging times, when the rhetoric of freedom has turned into something that both rouses and repels. On Freedom explores how we might think, experience, or talk about freedom now, by tracing the concept's complexities in 4 distinct realms: art, sex, drugs, and climate. This event was recorded online on October 22nd, 2021. We'd like to thank our public sector funders who make our work at the Vancouver Writers Fest possible: the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island.
Well, I'm really excited to do this with you. Thank you again, and welcome. Yeah,
thank you. And I'm glad you reminded me that I was there, and I looked it up. I think it was 2017.
That's right. Yeah. So welcome back, I guess, in this bizarre way. Yeah.
I know, right? Yeah. No, I was glad to find that. It was a blast from the past. So.
I don't know, Maggie, if you remember when we used to have to defrag our computers. For the younger folks in the audience, we used to have to run these manual defragging programs on our desktops, and what it ended up doing, I don't actually know what it ended up doing, like technically speaking, but it made room and it like cleared things up, and it just ran better afterwards. And having sat with your book for the last month or so since it came out, I feel like it's been defragging my brain.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, kind of like this. I feel like there's expansion. There's been more room to think about things, and there's new adjacencies, and it's just kind of been rearranging things for me. It's been reading on freedom has been kind of an invitation, if I could use that word, for me to come along with you as you've been thinking through and thinking about freedom in these particular realms, sex, art, drugs, and climate. And I wondered if we could start, if you could start by telling the audience who may or may not have had a chance yet to read the book about the project and about what you hoped it would do in the world.
Yeah. Well, this project was like a real bear, like it had, I wouldn't think I would do this because I'm kind of a precise or parsing thinker, but I do tend to think in keywords, I've noticed, so like with The Art of Cruelty, I kind of turn myself into a kind of magnet, and all things cruel, at least then about aesthetics I was researching. And I think coming out of that book, actually, and then a little bit The Argonauts, I felt the same thing around freedom, but of course I knew it was a real bear because obviously in the United States and elsewhere, it's, the most abused word, ultimately perhaps meaningless, but I felt like, and this is before COVID and the kind of new, zombie discourse about freedom and personal liberty and communal good and all that. But I felt like there was just something that had bothered me ever since I was younger, growing up in the Bay Area right after the 60s, I'd been really bothered by this kind of right-wing, left-wing skirmish over the word that kind of took place from taking place for centuries, but in a more condensed history of my lifetime, kind of from like the late 60s, through the 70s, and the kind of triumph of the word in the right wing as opposed to the liberatory or emancipatory use of it. And so I was really interested in that, but I knew from the very start that that I'm not naturally compelled by only analyzing things through the lens of politics or political theory, and it's not my training, but nor is it actually. I mean, there's this great James Baldwin quote at the beginning of this book where he says, it can be objected that I'm speaking of political freedom in spiritual terms, but the political institutions of any nation are always menaced and ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of the nation. And I just thought that this, my book isn't about spiritual freedom, but I just thought that this kind of following Baldwin, this real interest in getting into what does it mean to be menaced and controlled by these other realms of freedom? These other spheres. The social, the spiritual, cultural. So I set up shop in these four arenas: sex, drugs, art, and climate, like you say, where obviously all of them have they're all political, and they could be given political reads like drugs and policy or sex and law or climate and global regulation. But I was more interested in what I was kind of calling the freedom drive, and drives to unfreedom in those realms, and what this, kind of, again, with kind of Baldwin's lead about what, kind of taking a different kind of temperature of what the word means in those places. So I had a lot of ideas for a lot of chapters, and the book was seeming really like it would never happen unless I really just chose. So I really just chose those four. And even within that, it took me, quite some time to research and figure out what I wanted to say in each area, And finally, under much duress of the pandemic, I finished it, and now it's out. So I'm thrilled.
Yeah. Well, I'm thrilled too. As you just say, you're very clear in the book that you don't take political freedom as a main focus. And then you acknowledge, while it seeps, of course, into everything, right? Of course, we're born into history, and we're negotiating these kind of larger systems of capitalism, imperialism, colonization, patriarchy, etc. So all of that is there. But there is this negotiation, and there is this kind of relating to them that comes out of the book. And that's kind of what you've just said. And that's what, so there, it isn't a focus, but it's very much there in the book.
Yeah, it has to be there.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's no experience of freedom that can be experienced apart from whether or not you're allowed to live on your land, or have an abortion. These things are all they define the realm. However, sometimes in politics, people presume that there's a kind of coherent drive towards sovereignty, or towards towards self-governance or other things that, like, they presume a certain kind of subject. And I think, that's where psychoanalytical readings and things, obviously, which were very big post the rise of fascism. But obviously they really come in because, as just, for example, I think in the two chapters about sex and drugs, it's most clear that people don't go to the activities of sex and drugs just to feel mastery. They go to feel unmastered and experience with their subjection as well as subjectivity. And I think that I'm interested in that mix up.
In the sex chapter, I'm just going to read a piece that you've written. you say back when Foucault was all the rage, there was an ongoing academic debate about whether his thinking about decentralized, omnipresent power relations and the way resistance cannot help but be intimately entwined with that which it resists meant that we are less free than we might imagine and always will be. This question has been on a slow burn, I love this part, in my psyche for the past 30 years. Likely it burns behind this entire project. It's only lately, however, that I've really been able to hear Foucault, or rather hear him anew, end quote. And then you quote Foucault directly, which I won't read the whole thing, but basically that power relations are possible only insofar as subjects are free, and later that the idea of power, that the idea that power is a system of domination that controls everything and leaves no room for freedom cannot be attributed to me. As you say, this is a core idea that animates this whole book. And for me as a reader, when I read that, I felt like things just kind of clicking into place. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about what you're talking about there and what Foucault's on about.
I mean, I'm so tempted. I'm not going to do it, but I'm so tempted to look up this other Foucault quote on my computer that I actually had found much later. I don't, after the book was in production, I don't know why I didn't come upon it earlier, but that Foucault actually has even said that an extension of that, like what you were just reading, him saying that the whole purpose of his work was to make people realize they were freer than they thought, not the opposite at all. And so I think, there's always this danger. And I knew that this whole book took this whole risk of it. And it's a kind of danger that makes a lot of sense. Even if it does stem from a kind of paranoid or paranoid/realistic read of situation, which is to say that I think people get very worried to talk about ways in which we're freer than we thought, because worry is that we will then denigrate or turn a blind eye to or gaslight around all the ways in which we're not free as we thought, I mean, it's haunted feminism, it's haunted many fields for a long time. It's a Marxist principle that, has to do with false consciousness. I mean, all kinds of different ways that this, but I think that I decided with the book that I would take this risk of kind of saying, if we only, I mean, this is the kind of Foucauldian, but if we only concentrate on exposing, which is, again, the kind of paranoid read, and only exposing the ways in which we're less free than we thought, then just like any habit of mind, we get really, really good at a kind of disempowerment habit of mind, the kind of like, yes, I would, but, or that's fine, except that, but, we're going for something better than that, and I think anybody, even in like your most personal life, even when you're feeling most oppressed by circumstance, at least my own experience with therapy or anything else, the goal is very often to find what places can you find agency and empowered action, where can you do something that might better your situation rather than do nothing. And so I think that the book, like I said, I think it's a risk, but I think that's why the book is kind of, I think it's why it took so long to write, was because in this world, this kind of Twitterverse world that just ricochets between like, I think about Carolee Schneemann and Yvonne Rainer, actually a famous kind of disagreement they had about sex back in the 60s and 70s, where Carolee would say to Yvonne, you make sex too hard. And Yvonne would say to Carolee, well, you make it too easy, so this kind of ricochet back and forth between like, is it harder than we think or is it easier than we think? I wanted to try to get the tone of the book to demonstrate how maybe we could step out of that, and knowing that it has risks and paying homage to the risks, but also trying to do something a little different.
I mean, you even say, I think it's earlier in the book, that one of the reasons that despite all the reasons to not write a book about freedom, like you've been saying right now, that one of the reasons that the term stuck is your reservation about the type of rhetoric that kind of frames liberation as a one-time event, either in the past or in the future, rather than, in your own words, as an unending present practice, something already going on, which I think relates to what you've been just saying. This distinction is really exciting for me, and I'm going to ask you about kind of how this book is shaped by abolitionist thought in just a minute. But I did want to pause and ask you about the late David Graeber, who, of course, we lost just last year, and his words, and I quote here, "Revolutionary action is not a form of self-sacrifice, a grim dedication to doing whatever it takes to achieve a future world of freedom. It is the defiant insistence on acting as if one is already free," end quote. And you've said that these words have been a guide for you. And I just would love to hear you talk more about this idea of freedom as a present practice.
I mean, it's not even though I quote, say, like Martin Luther King Jr. Speech about that one day freedom will come, and kind of pairing that with the day of reckoning. And even though I use that as an example of this kind of freedom as the horizon that can never be met, I mean, I think it's important to note that as per abolitionist or civil rights rhetoric, there's all in those movements, there's always two discourses. One is the ongoing unending practice in the moment that's like handed down to people, saying like, I will never see the end of this work in my lifetime. Now it's for you to do, and then there's this like vista thinking, that the day to come. I think that they can work, and they do work in an interesting dialectic, but I also think that there's something about the idea that like one day freedom will come that can make everything that happens in this lifetime a grand disappointment, and a kind of grand not good enough. And there's a lot, again, that's like not good enough. But I do think that as Graeber's whole career, was spent in some ways looking at ways that people resist systems of domination or other things in kind of wily and maybe not immediately apparent to the naked eyes ways. And not to say, nor do I think he would say that those are good enough. They're not like the resting point, but they are, they're important to keep your eye on for figuring out, to know in a felt way what you already have that you want to keep. And when I say that, I'm quoting, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in the Undercommons. Well, there's an interview in the back, and Moten is talking about the Mississippi Freedom Schools in the United States. And he's saying that as part of the curriculum, there were two operative questions. One was, what do we not have that we need? And the other one was, what do we already have that we want to keep? And those two questions I just also thought of all throughout this book, because if you just focus on what do we need, from the powers that be, or from, like the place at the table, and you don't, and you lose sight of what we already have that we want to keep, then we kind of lose sight of the wealth, that we do have. And I think that is, and in some ways, and this is a psychoanalytic angle, in some ways that wealth, even though it's the part that feels good, it actually can be harder sometimes to see and sustain. And that's why, when Moten also asks in the Undercommons that they started asking together, why do places that we go to feel good, like the Vancouver, like festival, or like academia or activism, like why do these places often feel, why do we often feel so full of bad feelings sometimes? Sometimes there's good feeling too. But I think trying to figure out what's like a habit of mind about bad feeling, or like social media. We go to it, like everyone says they feel terrible. We keep going to it, like what, so we're doing something, right? So what is it not giving us that we need? And what do we have on it we want to keep? And then how could we imagine, say, what we like about it if we were to like get rid of Facebook, get rid of these things, like what could we imagine that we could drag over from what we want to keep and like build a new system anyway? So these were the kind of thoughts that were really motivating to me as I was writing.
Yeah, it's reminding me of Fred Moten says the best way to protect joy is by practicing it, right? And that's I don't know if that's in the Undercommons or not, but that's just something that came to my mind.
And again, easier said than done in a way.
Yeah.
So I think that's why this book spends so much time with Eve Sedgwick's kind of foundational essay about the paranoid and the reparative, because the paranoid and the reparative, where like the paranoid looks to like ward off threats, but as it wards off threats, it like inhibits joy. And the reparative looks for ways to seek nourishment, and sometimes including joy. The way that those things often weave together and can't necessarily be disentangled, but that you can notice them as habits of mind or being, and then try and amplify parts that you, that you feel like you might be missing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That I won't get into that whole part just because it's dense, but I really enjoyed that part. I just wanted to say that. I just want to go back to the abolitionist point. You, of course, are in conversation with many abolitionists in the book: Angela Davis, Miriam Cava, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and others. And as I was reading it, and even as you're speaking tonight, I keep thinking about Gilmore's argument that abolitionist critique shows how relationships of unfreedom consolidate and stretch, but not for the purpose of documenting misery, which is what you've been saying. Rather, the point is not only to identify these central contradictions in regimes of dispossession, but also urgently to show how radical consciousness in action resolves into liberated lifeways. And those are her words, however provisional that may be, is kind of what she says after that. This idea resonates, I think, with the way that you also talk about freedom in the book. And so I wanted to ask about kind of how your thinking and this book in particular has been influenced by abolitionist and anti-carceral kind of thinking and texts.
I mean, I don't get into, again, the kind of like it's not politically centered in a kind of like prison abolition movement, but I will just say, and it's probably obvious, like you're saying here, that the principles of those movements, I'm very interested in how they not just can be brought onto these different spheres like climate crisis or thinking about sexual freedom, but actually, again, not just dragged over, but actually more lived in those places. And I think that, in feminism, as you and I both know, there's been a lot of argument about, what is called carceral feminism and this kind of like lock them up, and it's very difficult because we're kind of in this moment, whether it's from, the rioters at the U.S. Capitol to Harvey Weinstein to Donald Trump himself, the ferocity of the desire to not allow all this impunity, police killings, all of it. I have found that some of the only ways that I know how to, I don't know what the word is, it's not launder, but like bear those feelings while also staying true to like prison abolitionist principles and things, is just to just keep reading prison abolitionists and going to the events and just keep keep understanding the kind of way that it's not an either or choice between like throwing your hands up and be like, okay, fine, impunity for everybody. You know, like that there's all this other way and other work that can be done about moving towards like structures of accountability that don't involve the particular police state that we have. And I think, and then in, you know, Kaba's case, and the long quote I have from her in the sex chapter, you know, was really important to me because it was a quote that she was speaking in a podcast about having been a victim of rape and talking about how if you'd asked her right afterwards what she'd want to do, she'd be like, I want to, you know, he should die, you know, like, and saying that feeling is important but that it can't be, and this is a, you know, a very abolitionist principle is like, you know, it doesn't then need to be rushed into a public policy that affects a lot of people that, as she says, didn't have anything to do with that particular circumstance. Right. And I think that, you know, I wrote 2 books many years ago about a murder in my family and had cause to go to the trial where the suspect was in fact convicted of my aunt's murder. And I think just from some of that foundational, experience, up close with a violent crime in my family and working with the state, not working with the state, but witnessing the state's prosecution. I think I've just been thinking for a long time about how to handle things like that with these commitments. And so I think that shows up kind of all over the book. And again, that kind of thing, it doesn't make people, I mean, I think it's a real conflict. I think it's a real conflict right now. I don't think it's fake. And I think, a lot of things about cancel culture and stuff are kind of fake. But I think this one, like if you're going to get into like a kind of intra-left conversation, you know, this one I think is really worth having because the habit of mind that is interested in punishment and humiliation and, treating people as disposable, no second chances, all that stuff is so at odds with certain abolitionist principles. And I think it's a hard reckoning. I think we can't just keep going along with, oh, it's cool, I say all this over here and I say all this over here. Like, I think it requires like some profound work. And so the book, again, I knew it wasn't going to be like people pleasing in that way, but I think that work it's worthwhile enough to give it a shot, you know?
Mm-hmm. I do know in the sex chapter, you kind of go through, and that chapter really resonated with me, of course, because of kind of the feminism and what feminism needs to deal with, basically, and what you talk about. And so you think through the cost of thinking about and seeing female sexuality only through particular lenses or through particular frames. And I think like loss and trauma are the words maybe that come up, instead of, for example, say desire or subjecthood and what the costs of that are and what becomes reinforced when we do it over and over again. I really liked thinking about that. So my question is, I think I understand your concern here and I share it, if I'm understanding it correctly. What I wanted to ask you, what I'm wondering about is how much of this concern do you think is borne out in the sex lives of women? Like, do you think who are people out there? Is this impacting people? I was just kind of trying to think, or are people just out there having sex that does foreground desire and subjecthood in the way that you're talking about? Like, what is the impact of this very real thing that you describe in that chapter?
That's a super great question because I can't really possibly know the answer.
Of course, yeah.
To what people are doing and thinking. Yeah. I guess that there are 2 hypotheses that just come to mind as you're talking. Yeah. You know, one is that people are doing all kinds of stuff and having all kinds of experiences and having all kinds, which I kind of believe this is the one true one, maybe, but that when it goes to public discoursing, we get into these grooves, because even though it's horrible to say, I do think it's true that scripts about violation and trauma are more accepted. This is what Michelle Goldberg had said, are like more acceptable ways of talking about sex for women, talking about sex in the public sphere, even as they break silences and are courageous. It's just a more, well-trod public discourse, but like if you were to pile up like next to each other, you'd have a much higher pile. So one is that all this stuff is going on, and that it's really only a problem of like discoursing. I think that's probably true. The second hypothesis, of course, is that it does, I'm sure there's truth in both, that it does, that it does affect our, I only can speak for myself, but of course, feelings of vulnerability, sometimes violation, sometimes of varying degrees of shame. I think I was also trying to ride this fine line in the chapter of saying that there are wrongs and there are things that happen that are unequivocally, should not happen, and then there's the fact that sex has I think in some ways built into it some of the things I just mentioned about, not that it has shame, not that you can't decrease shame, the chapter of shame, but that like desire and the kind of saga of whether or not it's requited or requited in the same way. Even with a long-term partner, you could like touch someone on, in a certain way, even just like on the neck, and they could be like, I hate it when you do that. And then you feel ashamed because you're like, oh, I wanted to, I did it, and now I'm rejected. And then you just kind of sulk out of the house in the morning. It's not sex, but like, I do think that these are the stakes of our interactions, and then sex makes that kind of more technicolor because it's so much more vulnerable. So I think that there's a way in which, and I don't know if it's possible. Like, I think I might be like trying to vault into some Jetsons future that we're just not there yet. But like, I am trying in that chapter to kind of invite myself and others to try, maybe this is back to the Foucault quote you read, kind of make more differentiations between like, is I feeling this feeling? Does it mean mean that X, Y, or Z has happened? And like, what is making, and that involves, there's no like one answer. It's not just saying nothing's wrong here, move along.
Of course. Yeah.
But it is to like invite people to undertake a certain kind of reckoning, which I do believe you can only take as like a sexual subject, like if you're you have to be at the center of it to reckon with it. So I think that was the invitation there. I'm really curious to what you think, because your question was so good as to whether or not you have a hypothesis yourself,
genuinely, I agree with you. I think it's probably both A and B, what you're saying, right? It's not possible for us to not be impacted by what you're describing, but of course, there's, different levels and variations, and it's, hard to know.
I would say that both in the sex chapter and in the drug chapter, I end up making a fair amount of recourse to literature. And one of the reasons why is that it takes a certain kind of person to be willing to talk about their sex life in public discourse. It's private, not for everybody, but for some, for many. And with drugs too, it's illegal. And if you've ever had a book vetted, as I've had several books vetted for publication, I like write freely about like, oh, this sex and this drugs. And like, the lawyers are going to circle everything saying, these are invasion of privacy, or this is illegal. And like, and you're kind of like, oh God. Like,
oh, right. Yeah.
But my point with that is that when that's happened, when you get like a legal vetting like that, it reminds you of the stakes of talking about these things in public. And I think that literature, for better or for worse, has often been a place where you can go to get descriptions of sex or drug use without the person having to claim it in a first-person autobiographical fashion, or with certain licenses that even autobiography, once made aesthetic or literary, acts as a kind of distancing from. So I think, and that's, okay. I of course, love people speaking their truths in public, but it's just hard. I mean, there's a lot I don't talk about in public either, so I think that there's also this kind of vexed question about where and what would we talk? Like, where would this conversation be? And that's why I spend some time writing about Patrick Califia's, rejoinder to some of the anti-sex, anti-porn, feminists at the Barnard Conference that was, kind of famous in U.S. feminism at any rate, because, Califia has this great kind of comment where, after taking all this heat about now Califia being he, then being a different pronoun, about the kind of writing, the kind of pornography that Califia was writing, and about it seeming to some feminists, poisonous and patriarchal. And Califia, the quote I have is, Califia saying, I'd like every single person who's critiquing me, to tell me how they get off and how it corresponds with the women's movement. I'd like to know. It's not fair for you to keep saying this about me and you keep the rest of your stuff private. Now, I love that quote. I also know that no one's going to line up, No one's going to line up to that call, but I love Califia's courage in making it,
Maybe in questions, people will line up tonight and we'll get to hear.
Exactly. We'll hear all kinds of testimony. Yeah,
that's right. I do want to ask you this. This is, I was really, midlife was on my mind when I was reading this. We're about the same age. And I was re-listening to, I don't know if you're familiar with David White, but I was re-listening to him, his midlife and the great unknown. And in that, he talks about midlife as being a time where you have to put yourself in an adult relationship with the things in the world. And I felt a lot as I was reading this book that's what you're doing, is you're putting me in this adult relationship with the world. And I wanted to ask you, if you being in midlife as you wrote this book, did that impact it? It seemed to me to be that particular time of life that this book would be written.
For sure. Of course, I feel like I'm perennially 16. Who doesn't, right?
Sorry, Maggie, I didn't mean to come here and call us both old.
No, but it's also funny because if you're a, slightly diminutively framed, female, you spend most of your life people being like, did someone give you the right to use the copy machine? And you're like, I work here, I'm a professor. So it's very odd to suddenly find yourself 50-ish. But I think you're utterly correct. I think that, it gets actually explicit in the afterword where,
with Emerson.
Yeah, with Emerson. Yeah. And I can read it. Someone in the thing says, please read to you. But I'll just read a little bit.
Okay, do it.
Maybe I'll read a little bit.
Okay.
I'll read a little bit and just take us through, we'll see. Okay.
Okay.
So this is the afterword, and it comes after everything. Okay. All writing, even that which attempts to address the now, ends up addressing the not now, if only because the moment of composition is not commensurate with that of publication or dissemination. This is part of writing's power. It also occasions certain temporal anxieties for the writer. Chief among mine is the fear that I will die before finishing a project. Talking with others has led me to believe that this fear is not altogether uncommon. Books long for both complication and resolution, which can make writing feel like running a race, while making the route ever more circuitous, the finish line ever more implausible. Another common anxiety involves fantasizing, by which I mostly mean catastrophizing, about the possible futures that might greet one's work in the world. Usually this takes the form of sublunary anxiety about reception. But at other times, such as our own, when a shadow has fallen over the idea of human futurity itself, such anxieties scale up and reach into more vertiginous territory. Beginning this book at the start of the Trump era and finishing it during a raging pandemic whose end, as I write, is nowhere in sight, has provided ample opportunity to wonder about what kind of world it might fall into, and due to climate change, what kind of world will come after that. Even if one has little to no investment in one's name or one's ideas carrying on, or in the fantasy of one's writing as a consolation for or bulwark against the pain of individual or collective mortality, there remains a problem, one Denise Riley discovered when she could not write for 2 years after the death of her son. Riley writes, "You can't, it seems, take the slightest bit of interest in the activity of writing unless you possess some feeling of futurity. The act of describing would involve some notion of the passage of time. Narrating would imply at least a hint of and then and after that," end quote. Despite my long-standing Beckett-like resistance to narrative, or my gravitation toward Beckett's notion that each word we write is an unnecessary stain on silence and nothingness, Riley's observation still strikes a chord. After all, a conviction of and then and after at is baked into where we are now, in afterward, a designation that means to offer the feeling of summation and temporal orientation, but really just means more words after other words, all part of a thought stream that remains unfinished and ongoing. In his 1844 essay Experience, Emerson spatialized this dilemma. He wrote, "We wake and find ourselves on a stair. There are stairs below us, which we seem to have ascended. There are stairs above us, many a one, which go upward and out of sight," end quote. Such in-betweenness may be our chronic state, but it has felt to me, as promised, definitively keener at midlife, where I am currently perched and where Emerson was perched when he wrote Experience. He had also just lost his 5-year-old son, Wally. The sense of being trapped on a stair, in time, in midlife, in our bodies, in pain, in history, in grief, able to see the import of our lives and times only through a glass darkly, is familiar enough. Certainly it has had some strong advocates, but it is not the only interpretation of our situation or the only tense in which we traffic. As Italian philosopher Rosi Braidotti, among others, has reminded us, there is also the future anterior, a tense notable for its conjuring of a future before the future, a little pocket in time, a fold, or a hatch, from which it makes sense to say, as Braidotti does, you will have changed. They will have fought for justice. We will have been free. Braidotti calls such assertions nomadic remembering. Nomadic remembering. What could it mean? From what place or time or speaker do such assertions derive? What kind of temporal abundance allows us to remember what has not yet been? Does "we will have been free" move me because it offers a consolation prize, slave morality style, or because I sense in it an inescapable truth? Does it emanate from a speaker who hopes, who in fact knows, that utterances made in the present can shape the past and future? Is it an assurance that arises from who knows where, the afterlife, akin to Moten and Harney's fugitive refrain, "If they ask you, tell them we were flying"? Were we? Are we now? So I'll stop there. But yeah, I mean, that notion of, part of me wanted to title the book, "We Will Have Been Free," but it sounded too like inspirational. But I was really, it kind of links in with what you were asking about before. A lot of your questions, both about Gilmore and about Foucault and about this kind of notion of the provisional zone and like just this notion of if they ask you, tell them we were flying, like, and this kind of sense of like it feels spoken from an afterlife, it feels like it's spoken from looking back. And yet, of course, like at midlife, this is to get to your question, you're kind of looking ahead, but, also I'm a mom and I have, it's what you're saying. I love the way you said it, and I'll look up that book, but about the adult relationship, kind of way that, you recognize as a parent that, all your kind of unresolved and juvenile and childish issues are full flower, in your life. And it feels like there's a question of like, does this all go on in this same unresolved juvenile fashion? Or is there a kind of reckoning where I say like, how can I, in the time I've got left, how much can I change and how much can I help things change around me in ways that I foresee as for the better, both for myself and the planet and my kid. And I think the whole book definitely was written with that spirit. It's a melancholy spirit, but the reason why I love Emerson and why I love that essay experience is that, Emerson was like a lapsed preacher, and the sermon structure is you kind of start with this, like, he starts with, where do we find ourselves on a stair? This is the beginning of the sermon, right? And then it kind of moves towards, this is from a different Emerson essay, but his sentiment, his kind of always onward sentiment, where he says, this time, like all times, is a very good one, if we but know what to do with it. And like, that's kind of where most of those kind of lapsed sermons end up. And I felt that in my writing, like I felt that kind of structure, like here we find ourselves and how do we know what to do with our time? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. I'm glad you did that. When you say that you might have called it something else, I did want to ask you if you meant for on freedom to sometimes sound like unfreedom in my brain. Was that on purpose? I know you do things on purpose with titles, so I wanted to ask
that. I mean, this book was really hard to title because it had a lot of, for a long time I was calling it Freedom Knots with a K. Knots of Freedom, which has the unfreedom in it. Everything with the word freedom in it just sounds like songs of freedom or freedom fries and whatever. It's very hard. But so I eventually kind of put the bulk of my meaning into the subtitle.
Yes.
And let the initial title just be, as simple as it comes,
Right. And the ending of the book, there's Arundhati Roy shows up in the pandemic is the portal thing. And I thought that was it was fun for me because it's the end of her book, the 2020 book called Azadi, which means freedom in Urdu and Persian. So it was just like a really fun thing that you both had books come out in 2 years and both called freedom, and you kind of ended both in the same way. Yeah. So I thought that was really special. I'm taking all the time and there are questions. So I'm going to stop talking. Would you like to read these, Maggie, or would you like me to read them?
I'm reading.
Okay.
So it says, I recently read the Audre Lorde and Susan Lee Starr interview, Sadomasochism, where Lorde is quite anti-BDSM, and I was so let down. One of the things I loved about On Freedom was your engagement with the nuances of power relations and sex. Have you received pushback from other feminists about this treatment of sex? It's a great question.
Good question.
It's a great question. It's funny. I was just reading a Chris Hedges book the other day, a collection of interviews called Unspeakable. And Chris Hedges, too, had like lengthy diatribes against BDSM sex, saying people should go to a psychiatrist if that's what they were into. And I too, was like, I mean, this is a familiar thing, like I think I think that without offering a kind of meta-analysis of it, I think, some of it really, I don't know if it's this simple, but I think some of it might just be like what you've been around or like what communities you've come up in. I mean, the queer community and, growing up in San Francisco and the queer communities I've like been a part of since, it just, that view is just really doesn't correspond to the lived experience of practitioners that I know. So part of me just feels like it's just like there's tastes, of things, but there's also kind of getting into like, and this is a real thing in feminism. This is split feminism forever. This is back with the sex wars I was talking about. Like, as Gail Rubin had said, is there such a thing as benign sexual variation whereby whatever people want to do, so long as it's consensual, should essentially be treated as benign, or do we kind of make malignant certain activities and judge them? And, I'm obviously in my book, I'm very interested in, Rubin's concept has been kind of lambasted as like relying on a neoliberal subject or all these different things. But I don't think benign sexual variation has been fully reckoned with at all still.
Right.
And I think we've just begun. And I really love this quote from Amber Hollabaugh, who I quote in the book, who is a lesbian HIV activist, who wrote a great book called My Dangerous Desires. But she has a great quote talking about what she learned from gay men during the AIDS era and about sex. And she says, they never said something was, I can't remember the word now. They never turned something down or turned away from, they never like turned up their nose at something until they tried it, Right. And it was just and she just said, that's what I took from them. And I thought it was just a great quote, and I love it. And I more aspire to live that way, I think obviously these questions in feminism are very hard, and they're ongoing because of the kind of uber saturation of rough sex and pornography. And I think that, Amia Sarvassian's new book, The Right to Sex, and other books have kind of taken up, I think, speaking to people growing up now with like ubiquitous, the ubiquity of porn from the internet and on phones. And so I think, things keep changing, but, I still, even if it dates me, I don't care. Like someone once said with the Foucault, they're like, aren't you afraid of being dated? I was like, if the concept if benign sexual variation has not been really fully reckoned with yet, I don't feel like it can be dated. It's like the challenge of these things goes on. Have I received pushback? I mean, I think people who haven't read the book, and who like maybe hear secondhand, like something about the vibe or something, maybe have said bad things, but I haven't heard from anybody who's actually read that chapter thoroughly and, that's been, I don't know what the word you use is, pushback per se. I mean, and also I welcome pushback. It's fine. I don't like, I like conversation, so let's look at the other one.
I can tell you that the other one is saying, if I would love to hear Maggie speculate a bit about how this book might cross borders. That's kind of
Yeah. I mean, Project Runway is the answer to the second. I love it because we're crossing borders tonight here, and so I love to hear. I mean, even when Joyce was holding up the book, that's like a Canadian cover, which is different than the UK cover and from other covers, and I think that it just reminds me each time I see it that the word means differently in different places. I mean, this book is clearly soaked in an American milieu. Even the abolitionist tradition is not that it invokes is really American and more black-white based than it is diasporic. So I think that. And I think that that's fine. It is what it is, but I do think that, even within the United States and then of course abroad, some people have said to me, like, do you even know, like, how can you even talk about freedom given how unfree, people are living? And, of course, you know what I mean? Like, of course,
yeah,
of course. So I don't think, this isn't a like, oh, feel free while you're in your, prison cell, like being tortured. Like it's not it's not meant like that. But I also feel like one can't be so afraid of the heterogeneous state of the world that one is to, one can't spend the time pursuing one's curiosities, to their end,
Okay, well, look at that. I think that's our time. And this is On Freedom, 4 Songs of Care and Constraint. This has been so wonderful. It was so nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate your attention. It's I love all your questions. Really great.
You have been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers' Fest. To hear more events like this one and view our upcoming events, visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.